Hello and welcome back to the Airborne Lawyer YouTube channel, and welcome back to the TBM 930 World Tour on Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. Today I'm in La Paz, the administrative capital of Bolivia, and I've never been here in real life or on flight sim, in fact, so exploring this remarkable landscape is all new for me. This city is very high up, so we are at over 13,000 feet above sea level here in La Paz, and you can just see the city stretching away into the distance, built into all of these mountainous valleys at high altitude. On the TBM 930 World Tour so far, we have been to a wide variety of different places. So we started off in my hometown of Cambridge in the UK, we went up to Scotland, to Iceland, to Greenland, then over to Canada. We've seen big cities like Toronto and Chicago and New York and Washington DC. We've done a coastal tour through Florida. We've seen some of the Caribbean islands. And then over the last several months I've been slowly but surely making my way around South America, and that bit of the tour is now nearly complete. Today we're flying up to Quito, but we have quite a journey in store before we get to Quito. First stop on today's flight is Cusco, from where we can go and visit Machu Picchu. Then we're going to go past Lima, we're just going to fly over the capital city of Peru and head on up to Chagual, deep inside the mountains, for a high altitude, high octane, high energy landing, and then we're flying on to Ecuador. So, a quick look then at the route on a map. Here's La Paz in Bolivia. We're going to be heading a little bit to the north, but mostly to the west, over to Cusco. Then we head over to Lima on the coast. We're just going to swoop past Lima and then make our way into Chagual, and then continue our journey north into Quito. So let's throttle up here on runway 10 at La Paz. Normally I taxi the plane out and take off that way, but this is such a massive runway and it's been such a long taxi out here, I decided to cut the film straight to the runway threshold for takeoff. And the plane is quite sluggish, slowly creeping up here towards our rotate speed of 90 knots. That's all part and parcel of flying at this kind of altitude. So we're at 13,170 feet, thereabouts. And the air is a bit too thin, ideally, which means takeoff performance is pretty poor. But we're now in the air and starting our climb out. You can just see the city over there. And I mentioned this in the last episode, but worth saying again here just how big these runways are, and I assume that they are this long because aircraft need a long runway to just get enough speed up to take off. Right, so let's turn to the north and say farewell to La Paz. Almost certainly one of the most dramatic landscapes for any city visited so far on the tour. As you may have seen there, a bolt of lightning a few moments ago. The weather is a little bit uncertain around here. There's a lot of cloud clinging to the tops of the mountains over there. What we're going to do is now turn again to the left pick up our flight route. So there's the airport. This enormous runway. Climbing quite nicely, although I'm climbing in flight level change mode at 115 knots, just to make sure we get a decent rate of climb. Just a little bit of editing there of the flight plan, just so that we can pick up the route nice and quickly. See that beautiful mountainous scenery in the background, which goes up even higher than La Paz. Meanwhile, over this side, heading off to the west, which is the direction we're going to be following in just a few moments' time. Not a long flight to Cusco, just around about an hour, but of course I will be time-lapsing it, and I will speak to you shortly once we are on our approach. So welcome back to the flight, and we are now making our way slowly but surely into Cusco, and this is going to be another challenging approach. The terrain around here is very, very challenging indeed. Now what we're basically doing is just following the route into the valley which is just ahead of us and off to the left, and getting ourselves to a point where we should then be visual with the runway. We are quite fortunate that the weather again is pretty clear. I'm not sure I'd fancy doing this in bad weather. And in fact, let's just take a quick look at the chart. So we're doing the RNAV, or the required navigation performance approach into runway 28 at Cusco. So you can see the runway at the end here, kind of at the end of the valley. Now what we are doing is we flew into Ilmox just down here, and then following this route all the way in, and that is giving us altitude guidance as well as lateral navigation. So our next waypoint on the way in is ZO650, which is just here, and we need to be down at around about 17,000 feet as we then make our way to ZO648, and you'll see that I'm just at 17,700 feet right now. So what I'm doing at the moment is just using flight level change. I could probably do an approach using VNav, but just using flight level change in part just to keep the speed up, just to make sure that I don't lose too much airspeed, because again the airport here in Cusco is at very high altitude. So we're at 17,000 feet. We're going to be descending down to 12,700 feet according to the chart. Decision height is 11,800 feet. And the runway is at 10,700 feet. So, once again flying in through very, very thin air, and if we lose too much airspeed it might be quite tricky to regain it, because the engines will struggle to really get much torque in this kind of climate. As for the lateral navigation here, I am just on nav hold, just following the pathway which is drawn out for me by the flight management computer. And rather helpfully that does closely track what is on the Navigraph chart. So just making our way now down to 15,000 feet, which is our next altitude threshold for ZO594. Not quite sure what the naming conventions are, but we're certainly making our way in. Just bringing out the chart again here, you can see ZO594 is just here, and we're going to make our way to ZO556. And that's where we need to be at 12,700 feet. At that point we should be visual with the runway. Now adjusted the selected altitude to 14,000 feet. Just taking it step by step as we make our way in. And as we do so, over in the middle screen, or on the left hand side of the middle screen, you can see the terrain map starting to become more and more colourful as it starts to sketch out for us the terrain which we are flying through. As I say, this would be an awful lot more difficult if we were doing it with low visibility or in poor weather. And quite honestly, not being very familiar with this part of the world, I don't quite know what accessibility the airports have in this part in this part of the world when the weather is bad. Okay, so I've now selected 12,700 feet in the primary flight display just in front of me, and we'll descend down to that and then hold at 12,700 feet as we start to look out for the runway. can't see it just yet, I don't think. But I think we're gonna... Well, actually, I might just be able to see what could be the outline of the airport just ahead there. There's a slightly darker patch. Oh, once again there, look, the terrain map getting quite dramatic at this point. And that can really help, because that is giving me a good sense of what the terrain is, even without looking at it. But thankfully I can just glance over to the side and see exactly what it's showing me. So far so good. We haven't heard the caution terrain warning, so I take it that we are doing okay so far. And I should say this is not rehearsed. I have never flown into Cusco before on Flight Sim. This is my first ever approach, so this has just been a case of sitting down with the charts and figuring it out as I make my way in. So we can now definitely see the airport in front of us. There's a darker sort of rectangular patch. The distance there, I can see that the runway is slightly offset, which is absolutely as I expected it to be. Again, just a quick look at the chart here. I can see that the approach course I'm on is not aligned with the runway, so I'm going to have to make a turn to the left, but that's all fine. And now, just as I've had landing into La Paz and into a uni in the previous episode of the TBM 930 World Tour, this is where I've got to be really careful with the speed. So I want to sort of slow up the plane, bring it down to a safe approach speed, but then I'm going to have to maintain that speed, and that is where it becomes quite difficult. The other thing here is also that the line of the horizon can be a bit misleading, because I've got all these hills in front of me. It's quite difficult to figure out whether I'm flying nice and straight and level or whether I'm pointing up or down. Now, looking at the primary flight display, there's a nice clear solid line there which shows me where the horizon is. I'm pretty level at the moment, but it looks to me as though this runway is on an upward gradient. So that adds an additional challenge as well, because it might feel like I'm descending steeply into the runway when I'm in fact pointing slightly upwards. So just need to be careful there. So dropping back now to our desired VREF of around about 85 knots, nicely aligned. But you can now really hear those engines working hard. Torque percentage up at nearly 80%, and I'm still slightly losing speed, so I've actually lost a couple of knots of airspeed. I'm now down at 82, 83. And I'm flying straight and level, but even at this level of torque I cannot get the plane to accelerate. It's kind of stuck down at 82, 83, and that is why it's so so difficult to recover if you lose too much airspeed. So I'm on the right glide slope. I'm very slightly nose down, although it feels like I'm more nose down than it looks. Again, I think that's because of the runway gradient. 85 knots now, just pull very slightly back on the speed. But it's amazing how much power I'm having to apply here to do a final approach onto a runway. Okay, so off the power now. Plenty of runway to use here, so no particular pressure to get the wheels on the ground. There we are. And we are down. So that was a challenging approach and a fairly challenging landing as well, even though we had great visibility, the lovely long straight runway. It's still very, very difficult. Anything at high altitude is quite tricky, but in terms of approaches and landings, I think our next landing into Chagual will be uniquely difficult, possibly one of the hardest landings and approaches that I've ever done. Very shortly we're going to go over to Machu Picchu, which is located about 40 to 50 miles to the west of Cusco. But before we do so, a few facts around this historic city. So this was the capital of the Inca Empire from the 13th century until the 16th century. And it has been a World Heritage Site now for well over 30 years. And it is a major tourist destination. Nearly 2 million visitors come here each year. Might have been the capital of the Inca Empire. It's not the capital of Peru, of course. That title goes to Lima. We're going to be doing a flyby of Lima very shortly in this episode. But it is the capital of the Cusco region and of Cusco province, and it's the 7th most populous city in Peru, with a population of about 430,000 people. I don't think, unfortunately, that the graphics have been upgraded with a world update just yet, because everything looks fairly basic. But from what I can tell, there are meant to be a number of architectural sites to enjoy in Cusco, which date back to its time as the Inca Empire capital city. I mean, this is quite interesting here. It seems like we've got a few ramshackle bungalows right on the edge of the airport. I'm not quite sure how accurate that is, but we won't worry too much about that right now. Let's just get the plane shut down. Everything's switched off, and let's go and see Machu Picchu. So that is Machu Picchu. A lot of history around this part of South America. But right now, let's focus on another difficult takeoff. So we're at almost exactly 10,000 feet. This is the altitude in almost all other parts of the world where we'd be turning off the landing lights and going up to cruise. Instead, at this altitude, we're trying to get the plane to leave the ground, and we need to avoid the hills, which are straight in front of us. Slightly better takeoff performance here than we got back in La Paz. Looking for a rotate speed, as always, of about 90 knots. And I am aware that there's an alarm going. That is, once again, warning me of low pressure in the cabin. But I'm just waiting for the TBM mod that I use to be updated for the latest world update on Flight Sim, so that I can actually turn off the master alarm. It currently isn't working, but thankfully it has now stopped now that we've left the ground. So off we go. Farewell to Cusco. I am going to stick on the autopilot, just turn a little bit to the right, and then let's stick it into flight level change mode and pull back on the speed so we get a decent rate of climb. Bringing in the flaps now. I think we're going to have to go to the right to avoid this hillside. Even climbing at just 120 knots, we aren't going up that fast, and there is some terrain we need to avoid. But if you think that's challenging, just wait till you see what the landing is going to be like in Chagual, which is where we're going to be landing next. First, we're heading over towards Lima. We'll descend over Lima and have a fly past Peru's capital city, and then we will time-lapse the flight up to Chagual. So I will speak to you in a few moments' time once we are in Lima. Welcome back to the flight, and we are now coming over the capital city of Peru, which is Lima. And one of the most remarkable things about Lima right now is the fact that it's actually at sea level. There is the Pacific Ocean, that little patch of blue just over there. I say little, ironically, of course. After several flights in the high altitude climbs of the Andes and, well, further back actually in the tour, even down to sort of Santiago, which is still a few thousand feet above sea level, it feels almost quite novel to be flying down at low altitudes like we are now. At 3,000 feet, goodness me, just imagine. And here is the city just below us. Now, one thing we can see here straight away is an impressive bit of coastline which stretches for 50 miles, apparently all the way up the Lima coast. I'm just going to take the drone out whilst the TBM 930 is flying by. 9 million people live in metropolitan Lima. It's the 5th largest city in South America, and it's the 2nd largest desert capital city after Cairo in Egypt. It's located on a desert strip between the Pacific Ocean and the Andes. And the fact that Lima is a desert capital city means that it has a very interesting climate. It's very dry because the city never experiences proper rain. It might get occasional drizzle, but the food is great, the weather is good, there's lots to do alongside this 50-mile coastline, so it's a very, very popular holiday destination for Peruvians and international tourists. That all makes Lima something of a cultural melting pot as well. It's a city strongly influenced by European, Andean, African and Asian cultures. And the city is apparently known as the gastronomical capital of the Americas, mixing Spanish, Andean and Asian culinary traditions. It sounds absolutely delicious. I'll be sure to visit sometime soon. But this is just a flying visit of Lima. Somewhere down here there will be the seat of government and the financial core of Peru. And there's a whole lot of industry and commerce as well. 2/3 of Peruvian industry is generated here in the capital. Over here there's the historic 70-year-old National Stadium of Peru. But we must now continue our journey north and jump back into the TBM 930 and head back to the mountains towards Chagual. Chagual is located deep within a mountainous ravine about an hour north of here. I'm going to time-lapse the film and I'll speak to you on the approach very, very shortly. So welcome back to the flights. And welcome back to the mountains. And just in the centre of the screen there, you will see the airport that we are heading to. That is Chagual down there. And you'll see that there's a river right alongside the runway. Now, one end of that runway we can't get into. We certainly can't land into because there's a block of mountain at the end of it. The other end we can land into. That was the end which abuts the river. But that means we will need to fly along the ravine and approach it from that direction. And I can't find much guidance on how to do this. So there are no Navigraph charts for Chagual. I have been using Google Maps and a few YouTube videos of pilots in real life flying into Chagual to figure out how best to do this. And the conclusion that I've reached from that is that we need to fly along the river and land at the end of the runway that abuts the river. When we take off, we will need to take off from the opposite end of the runway. So this is going to be uniquely challenging. I have done Lukla before in the Himalayas. That's very, very difficult. That's the airport nearest to Mount Everest. I think this is going to be similar to Lukla. In Lukla you've got a colossal mountain at the end of the runway, and it's on a very steep gradient. It's very, very difficult to judge and get right, but you do at least have half decent visibility of the runway. Here, because we are flying to the end of the runway that abuts the river, from what I can tell, it will not be visible, the runway will not be visible until we are right on top of it. So I've kind of got very little room for error here in making this approach. Now, nonetheless, I'm kind of figuring this out as I go. As I say, there aren't any charts available. I'm currently up at 13,000 feet. I need to be up at 13,000 feet to clear these mountain tops. And what I'm going to do is descend and loop back round. So the airport is right behind us at this point in time. And the one thing I did check on Flight Sim before doing this flight was what altitude are you at on the ground at Chagual, and it's around about 4,000 feet. So we've got 9,000 feet to descend through, and on my navigation display just in the center screen here I can see lots of black right in front of me once I've cleared this mountain ridge that I'm flying over right this second. That black means that there is no territory I'm going to immediately collide with if I start descending. So you can turn off the autopilot, and I'm going to fly this by hand. We can start to descend into the ravine. So at the moment I'm looping back round. For anyone who's flown holding patterns in an airliner, this is a little bit like a teardrop entry into a holding pattern, if that makes any sense. I'm sort of doing the loop round at the bottom at the moment, and then I will be flying straight up the ravine, following the river all the way to the runway. Just keeping a nice safe distance from the hills. Again, very, very pleased that the weather is in our favour at the moment. There are clearly a fair few clouds in the sky here, but the visibility is good. I can only assume that there is no possibility of making an approach into Chagual where visibility is limited. I've set 4,500 feet just in the primary flight display, just so I've got an idea of when I'm going to reach 4,500 feet. I've set 4,500 feet because if we are going to be at 4,000 feet at the time we touch down in Chagual, if I maintain 4,500 feet as I'm near the airport, I should then be able to make a descent through those final 500 feet through the final 500 feet down to the runway. My concern would be that because I'm not going to see the runway until I'm right on top of it, if I'm up at 6,000 feet or something, I might see the runway and have to make a deep dive towards it, which just isn't going to work. I'm going to need to do it nice and slowly and have full control of the aircraft. So I'm going to keep the altitude low, literally weave through the ravine, which again looks like how it's done in real life, and I will eventually get to a point where I'll turn a corner and the runway will be right in front of me. Stunning scenery around here. It looks really lovely. I would probably think this isn't ideal terrain to be flying through, but this is a real airport. Turboprops flying here all the time. In fact, twin-engine turboprops appear to frequent Chagual, looking at the YouTube videos of pilots flying in real life. So hopefully the speed and the nimble handling of the TBM 930 mean that we're very well prepared should I need to abort this approach. That being said, I don't quite know what I'm going to do if I have to do a go around. Weather looking slightly iffy straight in front of us, but we are going to be turning to the right shortly. This is sort of the base leg, sort of. No normal rules apply here, to be fair, but the airport is off to the right here along the ravine. You can now see in the navigation display. So you can see all the red, and then you can see the black, which indicates where the ravine is. That is obviously where there is no terrain which is going to present an immediate danger. So to do this without that navigation display would be quite difficult. And I'd also be slightly second guessing exactly where the ravine is, but that really helps. Just maintaining decent airspeed at the moment, and roughly around about 7,000 feet. Once we've got ourselves established flying down the ravine, I will then start to descend a little bit more, and I will also be pulling back on the speed once we are getting closer into the airport. So this now is sort of final approach. We aren't going to see the runway for several minutes, but it's kind of the final approach. We're now just going to be flying down through this ravine until we finally see the runway in front of us. There is the river just down there. Lots of adjoining rivers as well. Again, that's why the terrain map is so helpful, because I can combine what I can see out the window with the terrain map and get a clear sense of exactly where I need to be flying. Right now you can't quite see the airport. In fact, I think it's just starting to appear now. There we are. The airport is just appearing now on the navigation map in the centre screen. There's just a little purple dot in the centre at the top. So that is where the airport is. It's maybe about 10 miles in front of us, so nothing in flying terms. And at this point in time we're still doing 170 odd knots. I'm just going to pull back on that a little bit. Just keep checking around, just make sure I am definitely clear of the surrounding terrain. We're now just descending again, so looking to get down to 4,500 feet, a few miles in advance of the airport itself. This is the Maranon River. This is the La Libertad region of Peru. And the floor of the ravine is at about 4,000 feet or thereabouts. So it's all very challenging. Once again, as we had back in Cusco, have to be careful here as well, just to keep an eye on where the horizon is. So on the primary flight display there is that solid white line which shows where the horizon is. But when the visibility out the window is just chock-a-block with mountains, it's anyone's guess as to exactly where the horizon is. So yes, I'm flying visually, but there's also a lot of reliance on instruments here as well, just to cross-check in many ways that what I think I'm seeing is accurate. So I'm coming down fairly low here, now at 5,500 feet. Looks to me like the ravine is slowly descending itself. I don't think the floor of the ravine right here is at 4,000 feet, as it is just down the way in Chagual, but I know that that is the elevation of the airport. So we will just maintain this kind of altitude above the ravine for the time being. Just track it as we follow it through. Again, this next section of the approach, I have seen a few YouTube videos of where it's been flown in real life, and it does look to me to be pretty much a case of just weaving in through the hillsides. I might be a little bit lower than this would typically be flown. It's obviously quite hard to tell, but this is pretty much how it seems to be done. Settlement just down there. Okay, so I'm now at my target altitude of 4,500 feet, and now that we are into the dense part of the ravine, only a few miles now from the runway, and just pulling back on the speed.
500.
I haven't flown it yet, but I assume that when we leave Chagual and continue the journey up to Peru, we will be departing
500.
through this bit of the ravine as well, which will be challenging in its own way.
500.
It might well be possible to take this a little bit higher, but even so it's going to be immensely challenging flying through this kind of terrain. You're almost just looking to the left here to make sure I have actually got enough clearance to get through that gap. And over to the right, a little bit of rudder as well, just to keep the turn going. Scenery is absolutely beautiful. So we are now very, very close. I know I'm going to have to be down at around about 4,000 feet in the blink of an eye once I see the runway, relatively speaking, that is. So I can't see it yet. It might well just be tucked away behind this bluff, I think. The bluff I'm referring to there is that blackish coloured bluff just right in front of us now.
500. 500.
And the runway is kind of, well, it's going to be on our left hand side, and it will be on a heading of about 140 degrees, I think. So we're going to have a bit of a Hong Kong turn to pull in here. All eyes now looking for the runway. I think it's going to be tucked around this corner. Yep, there it is. Okay, there's the runway. So this is the tricky bit. Glad I've had a bit of practice doing Kai-Tak. Got a bit of a wind coming from our left-hand side. I think we might just about manage this. Ooh, perfect. Okay, just down in the nick of time before we slipped off the side of the runway there. And that's that. Chagual, here we are. Just going to coast the aeroplane to the end of the runway and park up. And you can now see why it is not possible to land on runway 32. Or if it is, I wouldn't like to approach that way myself. Goodness knows how you manage that. That's like a extreme Sant Barthélemy approach. So we'll just park up over here. It's obviously a very small airport. And we will shut down the plane and then go and take a look at the local scenery. Switch off the lights. Turn off the pitos and the bleeds. And we'll shut down the engine as well. It's quite like listening to the sound of the engine shutting down with the door open. It's just a nice effect. Okay, let's take a look outside in the drone. This is clearly a very remote part of Peru. The Marañón River is the second longest river in the country. And it runs along a deep ravine for most of its length, I gather. I don't know what the countryside around it here is like. It looks very rugged. I don't know if it's jungle-like in the hills here, or what the climate is like, but yeah, it certainly has a very rugged feel to it. A remote outcrop. There are obviously a collection of tiny, tiny little places near the airport. Presumably the airport is an essential way of getting supplies into these local communities. I don't know if it's a particular tourist hotspot though. Very little seems to be written about Chagual online, apart from flying enthusiasts who like to try it out in the way that I have just a few moments ago. Looks like they put quite a bit of thought into the airport scenery here on MSFS 2020, so presumably they are expecting a number of hobbyists to visit on the sim. So we'll jump straight back in and continue our journey up to Quito. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we will now be taking off at the opposite end of the runway, which means it's a very, very short taxi out. Get the landing lights on, and the strobes, and away we go. That is a pretty imposing sight to have in front of you just before you're taking off. I think I might need the F-18 Hornet in order to take on a climb of that gradient. So what I'm going to do is, as soon as I've taken off, I will be turning to the right and following the ravine back out. There we are, 90 knots. Take it nice and gently. Again, the air is still quite thin around here. And a nice solid turn to the right. Start pulling out and into the little space that we have here within the ravine.
500.
Just going to keep the flaps out for the moment. I suppose we are now over 115 knots. Just want to be a little bit careful in case I should lose my upward momentum by bringing the flaps too quickly. Okay, I'll pull them in now. That's good. And this is now, well, it's certainly feeling easier than the approach into Chagual. This is now getting a bit clearer, so We're now into that wider part of the ravine. And perhaps our main challenge here is to avoid any nasty weather which may be in those clouds. Some of them do look quite dark. Still plenty of red on the navigation display in the middle there, so I'm just going to continue climbing up through the ravine before I stick the autopilot onto nav hold to pick up our flight route. And what I'm also thinking is I might just keep to the left of those clouds. Just looking at the weather radar over on the right hand side of the navigation display, to see a bit of orange over to the right hand side, so we'll steer a bit clear of that. It's a little bit brighter over to our left, so if needs be we can head in that direction. We're slightly off course at the moment, but only fractionally. So I'm now going to go ahead and time-lapse the cruise as usual as we embark on our last leg of this episode up to the Ecuadorian capital of Quito, another high altitude capital city and our last stop in South America. So welcome back to the flight and welcome to Quito. Can't really see anything of it at the moment. This is some of the worst weather we've landed in quite a long time.
500.
And I have had to go for a full ILS approach, as you might expect, as we just descend through this wet murk into the Ecuadorian capital. You can now see the runway, just half a mile from the end of it. And we've got a 10-knot headwind as well. Oh, bit of a bounce. There we go. Yeah, so not a particularly pleasant scene here in Quito to arrive into. Hopefully we'll see some better weather before we head off. Another high altitude landing, 7,880 feet above sea level right now. And this is a major international airport, which is quite a contrast to Chagual, where we were just a few moments ago. One thing to pick up is the new chart feature on my modded up TBM 930, which is really great. Really enjoy having the charts up on that centre screen. And I needed it just now because it was full airline pilot mode, doing a full instrument approach all the way in. So we are going to just park up and call it a day for this episode of the TBM 930 World Tour. Another pretty epic journey from La Paz to Cusco to Chagual and to Quito. And in the next episode we will be saying farewell to South America and heading up towards Panama into Central America as this world tour continues. Quite sure I'm going to park here, but there's a man standing over here, so I may as well give this a shot. If you've enjoyed the video, please do click on subscribe, please do click on like and click on the bell if you want to hear about future videos as and when I post them. And I will be back very soon with more short and long haul flying on both Microsoft Flight Sim 2020 and on Prepare 3D here on the Airborne Lawyer YouTube channel. Thank you for watching.